the most ancient civilizations known to conventional archaeology, the conventional paradigm, are inheritors of a mythological system, a complex, sophisticated, subtle, and profound mythological system based on celestial metaphor and using it around the globe in the most ancient civilizations known to conventional history or admitted by the conventional paradigm, including ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia. We could show examples from ancient Mesopotamia, but I've been focusing on ancient Egypt. And in a video called How the Narmer Palette Totally Destroys Ancient History, meaning the conventional paradigm of ancient history, we looked at the Narmer Palette from around 3200 BCE, from the first king of the first dynasty of ancient Egypt, and saw how it is based on this celestial system of metaphor that's found around the world, and it's already fully developed in the earliest myths and the earliest artwork that we can find from these civilizations, including the Narmer Palette of the first dynasty of ancient Egypt. Now, I'd like to explore additional overwhelming evidence that ancient Egypt was an inheritor of this system of celestial metaphor. And this past weekend, I had the wonderful opportunity to go to an exhibit in Melbourne, in Australia, from the British Museum. The exhibition is entitled Pharaoh, and it presents pieces from the British Museum, including this base of a throne. The throne itself is now damaged, but on the side of the seat of the throne, this is the left side of a throne, the statue sitting on the throne would be facing to the left of the screen. The feet of the king sitting on the throne would be to the left as we're facing this image. This is a scene that is often described as the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt, or of being indicative of the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt. This particular throne and image are attributed to the time of the king Senusret III, who was a king during the 12th dynasty and is thought to have ruled from 1874 to 1855 BCE. So this is a very ancient artifact. It may be from even older than Senusret III, but the conventional timeline attributes it to King Senusret III, so as old as 1874 BCE. That's the 12th dynasty. It's right after the first intermediate period, so it's described as, this is a scene of uniting again Upper and Lower Egypt after this chaotic first intermediate period. And I'm going to go through the imagery in this scene, this uniting scene. It's a very important scene that we find in ancient Egyptian artwork. It's quite large. Here's Ksenia and I in front of that object in the exhibition. Let's go through this scene. Let's take a close look at it, and we'll zoom in a little bit so you can really see the detail. In the center of the scene is this, I call it a nail or a pivot, or it's a big giant awl or auger going into the ground. And on either side of it are two depictions of the god Hapi of ancient Egypt. He is a Nile god. He does have large breasts, and sometimes he'll have almost a pregnant belly to indicate, most scholars explain this as being that the god Hapi is kind of androgynous, in that the Nile, when it floods, it is the benevolent mother of Egypt, or it gives birth to the crops each year. The Nile flooding each year in the summer months, it would flood because of the monsoon season that happens between May and August in the highlands of Ethiopia above the Nile, and those floodwaters would run off into the White and Blue Nile that would then combine and go down into the Nile of Egypt as it flows north and flood the lands, giving life to the people. So Hapi, the Nile god, was a nurturing god. He had breasts and sometimes a pregnant appearance, to be androgynous in a way. So you can see that these are both images of Hapi, and actually the hieroglyphs on either side are mirrored if you look at them for the most part. So Hapi is actually pulling on a rope on either side, and that rope is tied to that central pivot, that nail that I'm calling the nail. But the rope is not exactly identical. It's not a mirror image on each side. It's not perfectly symmetrical. On one side, it's depicted as a papyrus plant, very important plant to ancient Egypt. And on the other side is a lotus plant. And the papyrus is more associated with Lower Egypt, and the lotus is more associated with Upper Egypt. And so this is described by scholars as being indicative of the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt. And in fact, on top of the heads of the two figures of Hapi are, again, the papyrus plant stalks on one side and lotus plant stalks on the other side. And you can see that these are slightly different. If you look at studies of ancient Egyptian symbology and artwork, this is a beautiful illustration from a book that was published in around 1910, but it is showing the difference between the depiction of a papyrus plant, I've indicated some over here, and a lotus plant. The lotus has these, the lotus blossom. You can see the difference between the papyrus, which is like a fan of little stamens, and the lotus blossom, which is an actual flower. Here's some more lotus depictions. Here's some more papyrus depictions here and here. And so you can see that on one side, Hapi is pulling on a rope made of papyrus, and on the other side, pulling on a rope made from the lotus. And those are indicative, we're told, of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, where they grow more abundantly in those two different regions. And so I'm going to show some evidence that this scene as well is celestial. It's part of this ancient worldwide system of celestial myth that is based on the stars. Specific constellations and heavenly features and heavenly cycles are encoded in the ancient myths from cultures around the world, including ancient Egypt. This scene I'm going to show you beyond a doubt is based on a very important part of the sky that I'm showing here to the right of your screen. I'm going to bring in some constellations. This is a very important part of the sky that contains this constellation called Ophiuchus. The name that we have for this constellation, Ophiuchus, comes from a Greek word meaning a serpent holder. You can see Ophiuchus has this central body, and then on either side is a serpent. One side is known as the serpent's head, one side is known as the serpent's tail, and Ophiuchus is a pivotal figure in the heavens, literally a pivotal figure, and we'll see that. Ophiuchus is located alongside the Milky Way, in fact, alongside the brightest and the widest part of our galaxy, the Milky Way, that is thought to be, by modern astronomers, what's called the galactic center, the galactic core. Ophiuchus stands right beside that bright part of the Milky Way. I've drawn in here. We'll look at it a little bit more. But remember, Hapi is a Nile god. He's the god of the Nile. And we will see that Ophiuchus is the central figure in this scene where Hapi is doing this kind of tug of war, or two Hapi figures are doing a tug of war on a central pivot. That is an Ophiuchus scene, And we will see that. Now, I want you to notice that the nail at the top is wider than it is at the bottom. Now, look over at Ophiuchus. You can see that the central body of Ophiuchus is wider at the top than it is at the bottom. It actually tapers as it goes downwards. And I'm going to argue that this scene is based, beyond any doubt, on this region of the sky, the constellation Ophiuchus beside the Milky Way, the Nile River in the heavens. Now, also notice that we pointed out that Hapi on one side is pulling on a papyrus stalk that's tied to the nail, and on the other side is a lotus plant. Well, I will show you evidence that beyond any doubt, the head side of Ophiuchus is associated with the lotus plant, which argues that the tail side of Ophiuchus is probably associated by the ancient Egyptians with the papyrus plant. Ophiuchus is that central pivot, and on either side, the serpent halves, in this case, are the stalks of lotus and papyrus with which Hapi, the Nile god, is churning the heavens. Now, where does this argument that this is a churning scene come from? It comes from the authors of this very important book called Hamlet's Mill. Professors Giorgio de Santillana and Herta von Deckend published this book in 1969, where they argue that ancient myth contains celestial imagery. In fact, it is based on the heavens, the heavenly cycles, including this ages-long motion of precession. And they talk about it. They didn't completely piece it all together. So it's a frustrating read in many ways, but it is groundbreaking in that they are assembling overwhelming evidence that the myths and sacred stories and artwork from around the world are based on the heavens. And they point out in a chapter called The Twilight of the Gods, they have this discussion of the churning of the heavens, or the turning in a kind of tug of war of this central pivot, and they show one of these uniting scenes, very similar to the one that we saw from that British Museum piece dated to the time of Senusret III. This one actually doesn't have Hapi on either side of it. It actually has Horus and Set on either side, but they have an image of it, and they say, here's Horus and Set in the act of drilling or churning. And they say Horus is the one with the falcon head. He's on the left. Set, his head is described as the Set beast. It's kind of a peculiar mixture of a dog and an ass is how they describe it. Sometimes it's described as looking like an anteater head, but that is Set on the right as we're looking at the image. This feature, they say in this caption below, is continuously mislabeled as the, quote, uniting of the two countries, whether Horus and Seth serve the churn or, as it is more often the case, the so-called Nile gods. In other words, this scene usually has the god Hapi on either side, or the twins, Hapi in twin form on either side, the Nile god Hapi with his large breasts churning it. So more often we see Hapi, but sometimes we see Horus and Set. The reason they chose this image with Horus and Set is on the next page, they're going to show some scenes from the myths of ancient India, specifically this scene known as the churning of the ocean of milk, or as they describe it in the caption there, the incomparably mighty churn of the sea of milk. This myth is found in the Vishnu Purana, and it's also found in other ancient Sanskrit texts, as they talk about here. And the authors of Hamlet's Mill are making the case that this scene from ancient Egypt is parallel to this scene from the myths of ancient India, and this churning of the ocean of milk. You can see it's a tug of war, and the rope that's being used in the tug of war in this case is actually a serpent. If you look at the image on the left, you can see that serpent even has multiple heads on the right-hand side. It's being pulled on one side by the devas, or the devata, and on the other side by the asuras. The asuras are like the demons. The devas are like the heavenly angels. It's like angels and demons having a tug of war, pulling on this rope that's actually a serpent. It's actually a multi-headed cobra, a cobra with multiple heads. The demons have the side with the multiple heads, and the asuras on the other side there. But in the center is this mountain, and the base of the mountain is on top of a big tortoise. That tortoise is one of the avatars of Vishnu, in fact. You can see in both of the images the tortoise or turtle avatar of Vishnu at the bottom. But the mountain itself is also associated with Vishnu. It's a mountain we'll talk about in a little bit. But this churning scene with the devas on one side and the asuras or demons on the other side, that's why they chose Horus and Set, because Horus is like the good guy and Set is the antagonist, the evil god, or the god of chaos, or the god of killing Osiris in the ancient myths of Egypt. So they're arguing, look, there's a very strong parallel going on here. And then on the next page, they even show, this is the last of the images that they show, but they're arguing that all these images are connected. They're all celestial. They're all related. They're all showing the same thing. And they show this image from a Maya Codex. They call it the Maya Codex Trocortesianus. In the bottom caption down there, you can see where they're writing about it. And they say, look, again, the exact same pattern going on, where we have a tug of war with a demonic figure on the right and an angelic or a positive beneficial figure on the left, and they're churning this central image. And there's even something that looks like a turtle on the central mountain. And this codex it used to be called the Codex Trocortesianus. Now it's more commonly called the Madrid Codex. But when the conquistadors came over to Central America and South America, they destroyed all the ancient texts that they could find. The Jesuit missionaries destroyed a lot of these texts so that there's only 3 codices for sure left today. There may be some more, but there's 3 that are considered to be definitely authentic. Out of all the writings of the ancient civilizations of Central America, we only have 3 codexes left, or codices, and the Madrid Codex is considered to be potentially the most important of those 3. That's where this image comes from. There's an actual photographic. You can go on Wikipedia, and there's an image on Wikimedia Commons. It's called page 21, I believe. But anyway, you can see that's the image. That's the full color image from the original codex, or from a facsimile of that codex. You can see the colors, but that's what the authors of Hamlet's Mill are reproducing here, or depicting in their book. And they're saying, look, this isn't carrying the serpent. This is a tug of war. They're churning. They're moving the pivot of heaven. And what they're arguing is, this is an ancient encoding of the turning of the heavens for the motion of precession, the ages-long grinding of the mill of heaven. That's why they call their whole book Hamlet's Mill. The churning of this great heavenly millstone over the ages delays the background of heaven, or it causes slippage in the background stars. We won't get into it. I talk about it in some of my online courses and in many of my books. But the motion of precession was thought to be caused by, or was being described in these mythological encodings as a churning of a central pivot. That's what the authors of Hamlet's Mill are arguing. So they're connecting it up with the heavenly motion of precession. Now, they weren't able to connect it to the constellation Ophiuchus. Again, I give the authors of Hamlet's Mill tremendous credit. In the introduction, you get a description of how Herta von Deckend said she was researching these myths And she was spending, years reading thousands of texts. And she said, there's something escaping me. And I knew something was escaping me, but I was absolutely convinced that I did not want to look at astronomy. She called astronomy, terrifying. It's so confusing, it makes your head hurt to really think about all these different heavenly cycles, including precession. What causes them? How are they? She didn't want to get into it, but she said, after looking at thousands of texts, and one in particular, there was just no way I could escape it. I had to admit that the ancient myths have an astronomical foundation, and I had to dive in, even against my desires. I did not want to look at an astronomical connection. So she did, and I give Herta von Decken and Giorgio de Santillana tremendous credit for publishing this seminal text, this study called Hamlet's Mill in 1969, even though they didn't completely decipher it. And I'm not saying I've completely deciphered the ancient myths, but she was using, and she says in that same description, the motions of the planets, mostly to try and describe and decipher all the myths. Well, the motions of the planets are, of course, extremely important. They're obviously connected to the ancient myths. They're given the names of gods and goddesses in the different myths around the world. They're obviously important, but so are the constellations. And we're going to see that this scene that they correctly identify with the pivot of heaven has to do not just with planets and not just with the motion of precession, but with this part of the sky that contains the Milky Way and the constellation Ophiuchus. They're absolutely right that these myths around the world are connected, and by showing a connection between myths and imagery from India and from Egypt and from the Americas, they're showing this is something that is outside conventional paradigm of human history, which is why their book, even though it was written by two professors and contains enormous amounts of evidence and footnotes, has basically been marginalized and mocked and ignored by academia. They don't want to admit the existence of a system that is found around the world and is already developed in the ancient myths of India and of Egypt and of civilizations in the Americas. That is actually, it explodes the conventional paradigm of human history. Now let's see evidence that they're absolutely right. This is another image of that same story of the churning of the ocean of milk. This is an image actually from Angkor Wat, and if you look at those pages from Hamlet's Mill, they talk about Angkor Wat and the churning of the ocean of milk in the scenes and the statues of Angkor Wat, which is in Cambodia, but is obviously influenced by the myths of ancient India. Cambodia is not that far to the east of India. So this is a scene of the churning of the ocean of milk, and I'll label the god Vishnu is the pivot. He's at the center of this tug of war, and he's also the pivot. He's on a mountain that is associated with the god Vishnu, Mount Mandara. Now there's another mountain that's sometimes mentioned, Mount Meru. That Mount Meru is also the dwelling place of the gods Vishnu and Brahma and these other powerful gods. It's like Mount Olympus is associated with the Olympian gods. Mount Meru is associated with Vishnu and Brahma and other major gods of the ancient Vedic texts and the Sanskrit texts of India. And Mount Mandara is especially associated with Vishnu. So usually this scene is described as having as its pivot Mount Mandara, sometimes Mount Meru. Doesn't matter. They are celestial, and I'll show you where they are in the heavens. Vishnu and Mount Mandara are the pivot of this churning of the ocean of milk, the heavenly ocean of milk. Now, at the base of the mountain that is acting as the pivot of this great tug of war is the great turtle or tortoise Kurma, who is one of the avatars of Vishnu. And I talk about how all these different avatars of Vishnu are celestial in their origins and can be connected up with specific constellations in my 2019 book, The Ancient Worldwide System, where I have more than one chapter on the myths of ancient India, so check that out if you want to really get into it. But Kurma is down at the base of Mount Meru, and then the tug of war that's going on has as a rope that's tied around the pivot. The rope that's being pulled, as we already saw, is the serpent, and that serpent's name is Vasuki. That is one of the Nagas. They are serpent beings. They're powerful serpent entities, and they have cobra heads, and often multiple cobra heads. And so the pivot of Vishnu has on either side a serpent. And then up above, if you look above Vishnu, that is the god Indra, and he is a rain god, and it looks like he's actually raining down on this great central pivot as the ocean of milk is being churned. So now we're going to see that this myth, this story, this artistic pattern is based on the stars in the heavens. As the authors of Hamlet's Mill point out, at Angkor Wat itself and the great city of Angkor Thom, which is right there by Angkor Wat, the city of Angkor Thom has these 5 bridges across a surrounding moat. That surrounding moat has these bridges, and on the bridges, this tug of war is going on with these figures, 54 on either side on each bridge, adding up to 108, which is a processional number, as the authors of Hamlet's Mill point out. That's why they argue this is a depiction of the churning of the heavens that causes the motion of procession. Well, you can see the tug of war going on. They're pulling on the serpent. That's actually Vasuki with the multiple heads, is what you see there in that picture on one side, and then on the other side is the tug of war is going on, pulling on the tail side, pulling on the head side. On each bridge, you've got this churning going on over the moat or the river, which the authors of Hamlet's Mill say, well, that's because of the Milky Way. They don't connect it to Ophiuchus, but we're about to. So this is that same part of the sky that we looked at, that I argued, the Egyptian scene with the god Hapi and the papyrus and the lotus and the churning of that nail that's wider at the top than at the bottom is based on Ophiuchus next to the Milky Way. That's why the god Hapi, the Nile god, is there. Now let's take a look at why we can say for sure that this churning scene has to do with Ophiuchus and the Milky Way. Ophiuchus is the pivot. Ophiuchus is the linchpin. Ophiuchus is, in the myths of the ancient world, a very central, pivotal figure, and I talk about that in some of my books. But here we have again the outline of Ophiuchus, that central body, which is wider at the top and then tapers down at the bottom, holding a serpent on either side, the tail on one side, the head on the other side, right next to the Milky Way, churning the ocean of milk. And we can see for sure that this is the mountain and the god Vishnu because of some of the analysis that I've talked about in some of my books. I'll just show a few of the clues here today. But again, remember the mountain is depicted as also being wider at the top than at the base in some of the artwork in the traditional depiction of this scene. Also, the god Indra up above is in a very distinctive posture, and we can show beyond any doubt that Indra is associated with the god Hercules up above Ophiuchus, up above that central mountain that's wider at the top than at the base, that's associated with Vishnu, that has a serpent as a rope on either side churning the ocean of milk. Can you see how I could go on. There's actually more clues, and I've talked about that in some of my other books, but this nails it pretty much beyond any doubt that we are talking about Ophiuchus as the pivot, Indra above in the posture of Hercules is positioned directly above Ophiuchus. So that shows beyond any doubt that Ophiuchus is that central pivot. Now sometimes instead of Indra at the top, you have the four-armed god Brahma, or sometimes the four-faced god Brahma coming out of the top of the pivot, and that's also associated with Hercules. Hercules with that square-shaped head. Brahma sometimes has four different faces facing in four different directions. That's also a clue that Hercules above Ophiuchus. This scene is Ophiuchus. The rope, Vasuki, is the tug of war rope on either side. And remember how I said that the rope is associated with a lotus on one side? And I argued that the serpent's head is like the lotus. And I can prove beyond doubt that the serpent's head functions as a lotus in some myths. Again, from ancient India, this is a different myth, a different scene involving, again, the god Vishnu. That is Vishnu, and he's dreaming while floating in the primordial ocean. He's floating on the back of this primordial Nag, the king of all Nags, known as the Shesha Nag, or sometimes the first Nag, the Adi Shesha, the first Naga, the king of all the Nagas. He has other names too, but this Shesha Nag is a companion of Vishnu, and in fact has multiple heads, and in those heads, each planet is actually held in one of the mouths of Shesha, according to some of the ancient writings. And Shesha is singing praise to Vishnu at all times. So, in other words, the planets with their motions are making a song that is a praise of Vishnu. But this is Vishnu reclining, sleeping on the back of the Shesha, this primordial serpent, on the primordial ocean. And what is Vishnu doing? He is dreaming the universe into existence. We're all actually in a dream. What dream are we in? We're in the dream of Vishnu. This world is a dream being dreamed by Vishnu, according to some of those ancient Sanskrit texts. Vishnu sleeping on the Sheshanag, and notice in the texts, as he's dreaming the universe into existence, Vishnu is described as having a lotus growing from his navel. If you look closely at the image, the lotus plant is growing up out of the navel of Vishnu. And on top of the lotus is the four-headed god Brahma, the four-faced depiction of Brahma. That's Hercules above the lotus. You can see Hercules is reaching down to grasp the lotus, or even to pick the lotus and eat the lotus. Maybe you've heard of the lotus eaters from the Greek myths, the Odyssey, the island of the lotus eaters. Why eat a lotus? Well, Hercules is reaching down to grasp a lotus. It looks like he's going to eat the lotus. But in the Sanskrit texts of ancient India, Vishnu is dreaming the world into existence. He has a lotus growing out of his navel. That's that lotus. That's the serpent head of Ophiuchus. And you can imagine that serpent head coming out of basically the navel region of the central body of Ophiuchus. And just to make it perfectly clear that we are talking about Ophiuchus, he's reclining in the Milky Way, or in this primordial ocean, on the back of the multi-headed serpent Shesha, the Sheshanag, with multiple heads. That is the constellation Scorpio. Ophiuchus figures will sometimes be standing on a serpent, or in this case, riding on a serpent. That is Scorpio with his multiple heads. I like to draw Scorpio with multiple heads, and you can see all the stars at that head end of Scorpio. So that's the side that the demons are pulling on, the multiple head side, and that is the lotus side in this depiction from ancient Egypt. And we can see that the lotus is definitely associated with Ophiuchus, one particular side of Ophiuchus, in this case, the serpent head side of Ophiuchus. So beyond any doubt, we are talking about a system that is already worldwide in ancient times, in the times of the most ancient civilizations that we know of. Ancient Egypt it is already fully developed and showing up in the Narmer palette and in these ancient so-called uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt scenes. These are celestial scenes. They're always interpreted as being political scenes by conventional Egyptologists because they don't want to look at the possibility that all of this is based on the stars and that it is worldwide, because we find it also in India. And we also find it across the oceans in the texts of the Maya. This one of the few surviving texts from the ancient Maya, but this text is almost universally acknowledged to be pre-European contact, and it shows a variation of the same scene. So it's either popping up independently in all these cultures around the world, which I believe is very unlikely for a lot of reasons, or another possibility is maybe Egypt is going around and taking it, because Egypt is so ancient, maybe they took it to India and then they took it to the Maya. But I don't actually believe that in the conventional theory. The conventional paradigm of ancient human history also doesn't admit the possibility that Egypt was traveling around and spreading their mythology around all these different cultures, because it is found worldwide. There's some reasons why Egypt probably wasn't taking it all over the place, because they've already got it in their earliest texts and traditions, and India already has it in its earliest texts and traditions, but they're already different. So you can see they're so different. It's like it's already evolved in all these different ancient cultures and civilizations into different kind of permutations, but it obviously has a common source. Or the most likely explanation is it comes from an even more ancient common source that all these different cultures around the world are inheriting, and they're remembering it, but it's taking on different forms in different cultures among different people. Different men and women are changing it based on their cultures, but it still has clearly identifiable features. It most likely comes from a source, a time that I call the deep ancient time. I call it that to distinguish it from what we call ancient human history. I call that the near ancient time. These near ancient civilizations, maybe 3000 BC or the Narmer palette 3200 BC, are inheriting from something even more ancient. So I call them the near ancient. Even though they're very ancient, 5,000 years ago, they are inheriting a system that may come from a time even more ancient to them than they are to us, the deep ancient time. And maybe they are separated from it by some kind of a catastrophe. But the myths around the world present us with overwhelming evidence that they are part of some ancient worldwide system. That ancient system is based on the stars. It is encoding, using celestial metaphor, these heavenly phenomena and cycles like precession, and this system uses the constellations. The gods and goddesses are associated with specific constellations as part of a system, and this system is already developed in ancient India, ancient Egypt, the Maya, and other cultures around the world. I could mention similar examples from ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, the Norse myths, Africa, Australia, China, Japan. This system is found around the world. So I don't believe that Egypt is the one who spread it around the world. I believe the most likely explanation is it comes from an even deeper ancient time that has now been forgotten and completely denied by conventional history. But the evidence is overwhelming. The conventional paradigm is starting to crack. It's like a dam of evidence. There's archaeological evidence, and I'm showing there is overwhelming mythological evidence that there is something even more ancient than these near ancient civilizations. There's something even deeper that conventional timelines don't want to acknowledge, but the evidence is so overwhelming from all these different directions that it is starting to make cracks in the conventional paradigm, and the conventional paradigm is going to burst. It's going to collapse because it cannot stand up under the weight of evidence, the overwhelming weight of evidence that shows there was a sophisticated, advanced, ancient culture or cultures, ancient civilization or civilizations long before Egypt, long before any civilizations acknowledged by the conventional paradigm. Thank you so much for watching.